There's this thing called imposter syndrome, or as my mom likes to refer to it as, the feeling every Harvard student gets first semester freshman year. It's the feeling you get where you feel as if you're only where you are because everybody else around you has made a mistake about your abilities. And when York County first hired me back in August, I was suffering from a really bad case of imposter syndrome. I was the worst student teacher in my pre-service cohort. And when I say that, I'm not speaking with false modesty. My cooperating teacher told my university supervisor that he could honestly say I was the most improved student teacher he'd ever had, which sounds like a compliment, but is actually a very tactful way of saying that I was the suckiest of his past year teachers and worked my way towards average. Most William & Mary student teachers start off average and end up somewhere a little bit above average. My feelings of inadequacy were only made worse during new teacher orientation, when I discovered that I was one of only 3 first-year teachers, and of all of the teachers there, I was pretty much, especially the first-year teachers, I was the only one new to the area. I don't know how I managed to squeak in when most of the teachers at new teacher orientation couldn't even really be considered new. So, my first month of teaching, I basically threw myself into my work because I couldn't let people know that they made a mistake hiring me. I was staying up really late at night, doing all this lesson planning, and it was starting to kind of wear on myself. So, I did what any modern gal would do. I complained on the internet. I Skyped a friend from college for a little ritual we like to call wine and wine, where basically we complain and drink. And during our little drinking session, or complaining session, if you will, I told him about my imposter syndrome. And he was a really great comfort, but at the same time, he was brutally honest. He told me that, yeah, York County probably could have hired somebody with more experience. And yeah, they probably could have hired a teacher who may be a better teacher than I'll ever be. And in fact, you probably saw a lot of better teachers than I'll ever be on this stage tonight. But if there's one thing I can do, is that I can go from sucking the most at something to being sort of kind of good at it. So during new teacher orientation, while I was still trying to kind of grapple with the fact that I'm dealing with these feelings of imposter syndrome, I would come to learn that I would be teaching world history. So I had a new kind of thing to worry about. How was I going to teach all of world history, everything that's happened on this planet, to a bunch of 9th and 10th graders? And while the questions were still going in my head of how I was going to pace things out, what kind of activities I'd be doing, maybe what kind of video clips I'd be showing, one thing I was totally confident about was that I would be teaching with primary sources. Because frankly, they show up on the SOLs, but also because some of the most interesting things in history can be found in primary sources. And I also knew that teaching with primary sources was going to mean that my students would struggle, because I know that when I was sitting behind a high school desk, I struggled with reading primary sources. But my students are going to continue to struggle reading primary sources if I never actually make them practice reading them. So the first time I assigned a primary resource, I actually assigned 2. We were discussing the scientific revolution. So I showed them this text from a Catholic cardinal and this letter from Galileo. And I know for you seasoned educators out there, or anyone with the ability to see an image that's maybe 10 feet tall, you're probably thinking, wow, that's a lot of text to assign somebody at once. And you're right, but I did it anyway. Now, I knew that students were going to struggle with this, so I wanted to make sure they had all of the content information they needed, because when the biggest indicator of how well you're going to understand a text is how well you understood the subject matter before you even began reading a text. So I walked them through this cute little PowerPoint where we talked about models of the universe, and how the Catholic Church was trying to regain power after the Protestant Reformation. And we even talked about some scientists who were killed by the Catholic Church for kind of going against church scriptures. And then I was pretty confident that they had all of the background information they needed, so I told my class, okay, you've got the text in front of you, I'm here if you need any help, just read these texts, flag me down if you need anything, answer some questions afterwards, and what could go wrong? So I evaluated my students' ability to engage with the text with a seemingly simple question: was Galileo a heretic? And the yes or no was not really important to me. I was more interested in the higher level ordered thinking they would have to demonstrate in order to answer that question. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it, the results from my first class were really, really awful. So I went into panic mode. Something really, really bad happened. But if you actually look at some of these answers here, there are a lot of students who were definitely overwhelmed by the reading. Yeah, it's bad. There are a lot of students who are... keep reading. There were a lot of students who were really, really overwhelmed by the reading that I gave them and the task, and just the sheer, pages or words on the page that I had to give them. And you can see in their responses that by the time I asked them this question, they were kind of too exhausted to answer, and most of them blew it off completely. But there were a few students who were actually able to work with this assignment. So that tells me that there's not something wrong with the material, there was something wrong with how I presented it. So you see, I gave them all of the content knowledge they needed to be able to read these texts, but that's only half of the equation. They need the skill set too. And as their World History 2 teacher, I am the authority of what it is to be a good history reader. And there are a lot of things that I automate that my students don't even know that they have to do each time they read a historical text. So I walk them through the entire process of what I do. First, we started just with the Galileo reading. I asked them to identify the date the reading was written in. And they were all able to say the 1600s, and they figured out that, hey, this whole unit is about the scientific revolution, so this was made during the scientific revolution. Then I told them to tell me who wrote the text, and they were able to say it's Galileo. And then I asked them to tell me what Galileo's profession was, and they said, well, Galileo's a scientist. And I said, okay, good, that's good. Keep that in mind, because his scientific background is probably going to influence the things he's going to write about. Then I asked them to tell me maybe what we know about the scientific revolution. And because they got that nifty PowerPoint there with the whole, models of the universe, they kind of had a feeling there was some things going on with church and science that maybe we should pay attention to. And they started to kind of get a little bored and annoyed with me walking them through this entire process. So I said, okay, good, we're where we need to be now. You've got all the background information, you've understood that as a historian, you have to kind of act as somebody who is a professional at reading in a historical way. I turn you loose to read just the Galileo reading and answer just the questions about that reading. And then we came back and discussed it. And I walked them through the entire process all over again with the Cardinals reading. And again, they got a little fed up with me, but it was all, totally worth it. We discussed everything, all of the comprehension questions, and then finally, once I was totally satisfied, I introduced them back to the Galileo, is he a heretic question. And this time, the results blew me away.
Because he plays board.
Obviously, there's still obviously a ways to go. I have one student who's clearly more interested in Fortnite than he is in 17th century church politics, and I mean, really, can we blame him? But this is a huge improvement for someone who's this is the first time of me teaching with primary sources without a cooperating teacher in the room to help save me when things go wrong. And room for improvement's a good thing. Because, again, the first step to getting sort of good at anything is to kind of suck at it first in the first place. So obviously, my strategies are not going to be the best for you if you're maybe an elementary school teacher or maybe you don't teach history. But the kind of main point remains the same. Your teaching is you reflecting on what you do well and what you don't do well. And for me, basically all of my teaching is reflecting on my sins and trying to make sure I fix them before Jesus makes me atone for my crimes. And then once I'm done kind of reflecting on it, I have to go and actually show people what it is like to be a historian. You have to model the behaviors and the skills and the knowledge you want your students to demonstrate. And yeah, you're going to suffer for a little bit of time, but again, the very first step to anything is to sucking at it. And at the end, maybe you're going to get sort of good at it. And using these steps, my students have gone from sucking really, really hard at reading primary sources to being able to read college texts that I had actually been assigned when I was getting my bachelor's. So they're going to suffer, but it'll be worth it. Thank you.